November 1954, Vladimir Central Prison. An old man is dying in one of the cells. No honors, no witnesses. His body will be wrapped in a sheet and buried in the prison cemetery, the way nameless people are buried. But this man was not nameless. Just 10 years earlier, his name had struck terror into entire armies. He commanded armored wedges that cracked open front lines within hours. He captured cities and redrew maps. Hitler personally promoted him to field marshal. His name was Ewald von Kleist. And he died in a Soviet prison, alone, without a lawyer, without his family, without a country. How did a Prussian aristocrat, a cavalry officer born into a military dynasty, become one of the chief architects of Blitzkrieg? And why did he die in a Soviet cell without uttering a single word of remorse? To understand this, we need to go back 7 decades. Kleist was born in 1881 into a family of hereditary Prussian officers. A military career was not a choice for him. It was destiny, written into his very name. The Kleists had served Prussia and Germany for generations. Ewald was no exception. Military academy, a cavalry regiment, staff positions. By the outbreak of World War I, he was an experienced officer with an impeccable service record. The First World War gave him something no peacetime service ever could: a deep understanding of how men break under fire, how an army collapses when it loses command and control, and how one holds together when it does not. Kleist survived the war and drew conclusions from it: methodical, professional, cold. In the years between the wars, while Germany was stripped of a full-scale army under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Kleist was among the handful of officers who took military theory seriously. He studied the lessons of World War I, read the works of British strategist B.H. Liddell Hart on mobile warfare, and tracked the development of armored vehicles. His core conclusion: the next war would be won not by infantry, but by tanks. Not through grinding positional warfare, but through deep breakthroughs. Not by exhausting the enemy, but by disorienting him and cutting him off. Few people shared these ideas at the time. Kleist did. And soon he would have the chance to test them in practice. September 1939, Poland. Kleist commands a tank corps for the first time in actual combat conditions. The Polish campaign ends in 4 weeks. German tanks move faster than Polish headquarters can react. This is Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But the real test came in France. May 1940. The French army was considered one of the strongest in the world. The Maginot Line, a marvel of defensive fortification, was supposed to make France impregnable. The German command drew up a plan that many inside the Wehrmacht considered a reckless gamble. Drive armored columns through the Ardennes forest, terrain that everyone assumed was impassable for tanks. Kleist led the tank group that pushed through the Ardennes. The breakthrough worked. His tanks emerged behind the French lines before the Allies understood what was happening. In 6 weeks, France surrendered. Churchill called it a catastrophe that was almost impossible to imagine. Among German generals in those days, there was no consensus. Many feared a flank counterattack by the Allies. Kleist was more cautious than some of his colleagues, halting the advance several times against pressure from above. This saved a portion of his forces from reckless casualties. For France, he received the Knight's Cross. But the next campaign would be an entirely different story. June 22, 1941. Germany invades the Soviet Union. Kleist commands the 1st Panzer Group on the southern axis of the assault. Before him lie hundreds of miles of steppe and Soviet armies that do not yet know what is about to happen to them. In the first weeks alone, his tanks tear through Soviet defenses. In September 1941, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group close an encirclement east of Kiev. 5 Soviet armies are trapped inside the pocket. By German estimates, more than 600,000 men are taken prisoner. Yet even then, experienced officers could see the Soviet Union was not France. The distances were different, the resistance was different, the logic of the war was different. German supply lines were stretching dangerously thin, tank losses were piling up, and the Red Army, defying all predictions, kept fighting. Nevertheless, in the summer of 1942, Kleist received a new assignment, perhaps the most ambitious of the entire war: Operation Edelweiss. The objective? The Caucasus, the oil fields of Baku, and a gateway to the Iranian border. His forces pushed into the foothills of the Caucasus. German mountain troops climbed Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe, and planted the imperial flag at its summit. Kleist stood closer to the oil of Baku than any German commander had ever been. He never got there. While his troops pushed deeper into the Caucasus, something else was unfolding in the occupied territories, something that would later form the core of his indictment. The German command exploited the resentment that some of the Caucasian mountain peoples held toward Soviet rule. Among the Ingush, Ossetians, Kabardians, and Don and Kuban Cossacks, active recruitment took place. Thousands of men joined collaborationist formations, Cossack units fighting alongside the Wehrmacht. Kleist was one of the chief proponents and organizers of this policy. He saw it as military pragmatism, using the local population against a common enemy. At the same time, Einsatzgruppen, SS mobile killing units, and other formations were operating in the occupied zones, engaged in pacification of civilians. Soviet investigators would later determine that in the Krasnodar region alone, more than 63,000 civilians were killed. Peasants had their livestock, poultry, and grain confiscated. There were executions, the use of toxic gases in sealed spaces, and mass shootings. The question of how much Kleist knew and how personally responsible he was for these crimes would remain contested. A commander of an army group cannot be unaware of what is happening in his rear areas. The court would later resolve this question unambiguously, not in Kleist's favor. But before the courtroom, Kleist would have to live through the collapse of the entire campaign. Winter 1943, Stalingrad. The encirclement of Paulus's army reshapes the entire strategic picture. Kleist's forces in the Caucasus risk being cut off. Hitler hesitates to order a withdrawal. Kleist presses the case. Delay means catastrophe. The retreat is organized successfully, methodically, with rearguard actions, with the systematic destruction of infrastructure. Bridges, railway stations, metallurgical plants, anything the advancing Red Army could use was blown up or burned down. Kleist later acknowledged this openly at trial and did not consider it a crime. In February 1943, German forces abandoned Rostov. The Caucasus campaign is over. A failure. Kleist spends the following year in command of Army Group A, trying to stabilize a collapsing Eastern Front. It is already impossible. The Red Army is advancing along the entire length of the front. In March 1944, Hitler relieves him of command, officially for health reasons. In reality, because of strategic disagreements. Kleist retires, and in April 1945, in the final days of the Reich, He surrenders to American forces in Bavaria. American captivity seemed like relative safety. For Kleist, it turned out to be only the first stop. In 1946, the Americans transfer him to Yugoslavia. A tribunal in Belgrade sentences the field marshal to 15 years in prison for crimes committed on Yugoslav soil. Then, in 1948, Yugoslavia hands him over to the Soviet Union. The investigation lasts 3 years. The case is examined methodically. Captured documents, witness testimony, interrogations of the accused himself. Kleist holds his position consistently. He denies personal responsibility for the mass killings of civilians. He shifts the blame upward, to commanders Rundstedt and Brauchitsch, whose orders he was bound to follow. He describes himself as a career soldier who fought against an enemy army, not against civilians. The only thing he acknowledges without objection is the destruction of infrastructure during the retreat. He closes his final statement without apology and without asking for leniency. I believe that the Soviet authorities cannot charge me with responsibility for the atrocities committed by troops under my command. February 21, 1952. The Military Collegium of the Soviet Supreme Court announces its verdict. 25 years of corrective labor camps with confiscation of property. For perspective, Paulus avoided trial entirely and returned to Germany. Ferdinand Schöne received the same 25-year sentence but was released early in 1955. Kleist never walked free. After Stalin's death in the spring of 1953, Kleist was transferred to Vladimir Central Prison. No special conditions, no negotiations over his release, no cooperation from the prisoner. He did not give the Soviet authorities what Paulus had given them, and he had no intention of doing so. November 13, 1954, he dies. The official cause? Generalized atherosclerosis and hypertensive disease. In plain terms, heart and blood vessel failure brought on by age and the conditions of imprisonment. He was buried without a coffin, without a name on the cross, without ceremony, the way war criminals are buried. But that was not the end. At the initiative of the German government, Kleist's remains were exhumed. His body was dressed in a field marshal's uniform and sent home.